think first what we need to address, just from the top down, I gave a very brief overview, one sentence description of what the red-green axis or the red-green alliance is. It's the joint efforts between communism and Islam, essentially to subvert the West, the Judeo-Christian West, to subvert freedom and everything that we hold dear. But that's, pretty broad. Anybody want to start with, is that a fair description, or what did I miss?
Well, can I try what you missed?
Please.
I think it's a very fair description of what we're facing as far as it goes. We're clearly beset by, as you mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party and its friends elsewhere around the world and here, the red. I have a phrase that my colleagues sometimes agree with, sometimes don't, that characterizes the green as Sharia supremacists. They're, of course, Muslims, but they adhere to this doctrine of Sharia, and they seek to impose it on everybody else. And that's the case whether they are elsewhere in the world or whether they are here. And both are present in very large numbers, of course. But I just add into the mix what might be called the blue, just to keep things interesting. This is kind of the totalitarian trifecta, because there is, in addition to the red, the communists, the green, the Sharia supremacists, the globalists, who are also elsewhere and here, and also very hard at work, as are the other two, at accomplishing what I think is their shared immediate objective. Their longer-term purposes, as I'm sure we will be talking about for most of the evening, are very different. They each envision running everything. They all won't be able to do that, of course. But in the meantime, in order to realize any of their ambitions, they have to get rid of the only real impediment to them, which is us, the United States of America. So I salute you for putting this program on. Karen is a godsend, frankly, for our cause. And these programs, which I've had a privilege of being involved in for some time, are, I think, incredibly important. So I'm glad you're here for this one, especially with two of the best in the business, my friends, Robert and Trevor. Over to you guys.
Yeah. And thank you for putting that in the context, because they are all tied together, those all three colors. Mm. And it's impossible to separate them. Yes. Trevor, you're looking like...
Oh, well, I thought Robert would go next, but look, this is what I'll say. Communism is a religion masquerading as a political ideology. Sharia, Islam, is a political ideology masquerading as a religion.
That's right.
And I think this is a key point to remember. These are ideologies, and if I'm going to fault President Trump on foreign policy, I think his big failure is that he doesn't understand ideology. He thinks that everybody is susceptible to a deal, that if you offer the right incentives, if you offer deals that'll make the people wealthier, they will go for it, because that's how he thinks. That's how the business community thinks. But when you're talking about Sharia 12ers in Iran, their whole life revolves around bringing chaos to the world so their 12th imam can come back. They don't care about a hotel in Tehran. They don't care about more money. Their whole life revolves around that. Someone like Putin, for instance, you do a deal with Putin. He's an ideological guy raised in the KGB, inspired by the Eurasianist and neo-communist philosophies. He doesn't want a hotel in Moscow. He wants to be the new Peter the Great. He wants to be the new Stalin. He wants to go down in history as the man who brought back the Soviet Union. The same with the Communist Party of China. They believe in Marxism, Leninism, and Han supremacy. They believe in the great destiny of the Han Chinese people and the destiny of Marxism, Leninism. You cannot do a deal with ideological people. You can only be stronger and defeat them and get them out of power. You're not supposed to talk about regime change. I'm all for regime change in Iran. Wouldn't regime change in 1940 Germany have been a good thing, folks? Don't you think it might have helped the world a little bit? Well, I'm all about regime change in Iran. I'm all about regime change in Russia, all about regime change in China and Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba. And we don't have to spend blood to do it. We just have to stop paying their bills. Mm-hmm. And their own people will do the job for us.
Yeah.
Amen. Well said.
Robert. Yes.
Frank added a third color to the mix, and I'm actually going to mix them all together because it's all actually the same impulse. I think ultimately what we're dealing with are sharks. They are the sharks of human culture. They have to move forward and devour others or die. Now, this is something that they all have in common. Marxism, in the first place, is explicitly and proudly aggressive, expansionist, and imperialist because, of course, of the stated idea that the workers must prevail everywhere and the workers' paradise of the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, established. Now, that's all well and good, but what the reality is that once you have enslaved and impoverished a people, your economy will collapse unless you can conquer another land and enslave and impoverish those people. And then you have a chance to perpetuate it. And so what really happened with the collapse of the Soviet bloc was that they were not expanding and had bled dry all the territories they controlled, and thus could not keep up with Reagan's economic agenda and collapsed. Now, Islam is exactly the same. Islam is the shark of human cultures for 1400 years because the idea in Islam is that there is no work ethic. You may have heard or maybe even read the book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Mm. It's a book by the German sociologist Max Weber, who was not a Protestant, who was studying what made cultures be prosperous. And he postulated, rightly or wrongly, that it was the idea of human work as being blessed by God that the Protestants emphasized that allowed for the Protestant nations to prosper economically in a way that others did not. Now, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but I do think that there is a connection between core beliefs and the economies of those who hold those beliefs. When you come to Islam, there is no blessing to work. Work is actually a dishonor. If you're going to be working, it's because you don't own slaves. And if you don't own slaves, it's because you have not been a warrior and captured any slaves, or you don't have money to buy any. And so you are a dishonorable person. If there are no slaves to buy, and if there are no subjugated non-Muslims to do the work, then the economy goes into free fall. And I have a book coming out next spring called The Tragedy of Islam, Failure and Excuses that traces the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire on the basis of its having bled the dhimmi communities dry. And thus, they didn't work, the Turks. I mean, obviously, some of them did, and they did as much as they had to. But the whole idea of the state was that the Jews and Christians would work and pay the Muslims. And once they were impoverished and they had been bled dry and were no longer prosperous, the empire went into decline. So then you have jihad. They have to conquer more lands so as to keep it going. And it's the same thing, thus, as communism. So what we're dealing with are 2 or 3 variations of cultural sharks that have to devour us in order to survive and keep moving in that regard. And so they will not rest. I suppose the fundamental lesson is they're not going to sit down at a table and negotiate a settlement that's going to make peace. They'll just keep coming because that's what sharks do. Sharks don't have a talk with the halibut and say, okay, I'll leave you alone because we'll sign this paper.
Right.
Doesn't happen.
Doesn't happen. Robert, I was thinking when I was putting this together, when we did the World War III conference, the one in here in Los Angeles. So 2 years ago, someone had come up to you and said, this is all about China, but you're a guy who talks about Islam. It doesn't seem like Islam is much of a problem anymore. Do you remember that? And
No, but I believe you.
Yeah. Well, yes. And you said, well, it seems that way, but they are very aligned in what they require of people, and it's utter obedience. Head like a raisin.
Oh, yeah. Well, see, this is the thing about Islam also and communism, that they love each other because they're alike. And so they see the world the same way. And what they want is an authoritarian state. As the late, great David Horowitz said, inside every progressive is a totalitarian screaming to get out.
Yes.
And that is, there's a whole lot in that phrase when you think about it, that all these people that say they just want peace and equality and understanding, they will start to kill you. And now we're seeing that with the violence, the anti-Semitic violence that's on the rise, and the leftist politicians being increasingly open and unapologetic. Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries, Kamala Harris, Maxine Waters, and there are others as well who have all called for violence. And it's just taken for granted. Now, the whole idea is that they want to establish an authoritarian state and enforce it by means of terror. That's the leftist imperative that's played out every time leftists establish governments anywhere, beginning with the French Revolution. Now, that's what Islam does, because the Sharia, the law of Islam, is a slow motion reign of terror, where they don't come in and kill everybody to terrorize the populace into submission. That's what the communists do. But when they come in and establish their rule, and then you criticize them, you get beheaded. You steal something, you get your hand cut off. You commit adultery, you get stoned to death. And all of these things terrorize the public into submission. And so the whole idea is, once again, authoritarianism enforced through terror. And so that's why the left and Islam love each other. And Islam is also quite authoritarian. What Karen was referring to was a hadith in which Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, says, obey your ruler even if he's an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. And that's often quoted to say, look what a racist Muhammad was. That's fine. That's true. And that's important. But what's even more important is that he's saying, obey your ruler even if he's the most outlandish person you can think of. In other words, blindly obey whoever's in charge. And you notice that Islamic countries are all authoritarian. They're not a bunch of secular republics. And that's not an accident, comrade, as the Marxists say.
Amen.
Yeah. Frank?
Well, I don't know what to add to that other than to say that if you accept the premise that each and every one of these entities is intent on dominating everybody else, it can't end well unless they are defeated. And I think this point's been made by both Robert and Trevor. And what I find, well, distressing is too mild a term. Appalling is closer to the mark, is that we are, in this moment, we are making history in this moment. And sometimes that's obvious and sometimes not so much, but there's no getting around it. By foregoing the opportunity that Israel has created to finish the job, most especially with respect to Iran, which is, as everybody knows, the head of the snake, but also in Gaza, and arguably in Lebanon and Yemen and other parts of the region as well. Without our support, without our permission, without our, active material, logistical, intelligence assistance as needed, the opportunity is being foregone to end at least the leading edge, the vanguard of the Sharia supremacist piece of this trifecta. And in so doing, to change the Middle East and I believe the world quite dramatically. As Karen mentioned, we spend a lot of time talking about China. I'm concerned that the Chinese are reading what is happening at the moment in terms of deal making or the pursuit of deals in furtherance of ceasefires is almost certainly increasing the prospect that the Chinese will be emboldened to think they too can get away with murder in their part of the world, or maybe even here, folks.
Right.
And as Karen knows, these guys have heard me say elsewhere, just as one data point about why that is so alarming, is that in the space of the 4 years that Biden was operating and the border was open, we've reason to believe that somewhere, and the numbers vary wildly, the lowest I've heard is about 10,000. The highest I've heard is about 150,000 Chinese soldiers have been insinuated into this country and are presumably here awaiting orders to act against us. So what I wanted to just, introduce into this conversation as part of, the excellent expertise that these guys bring to bear is to talk about this prospect that this is not a problem elsewhere. This is very much a problem here, whether it's the Reds, the Chinese, their soldiers, their leftist, democratic socialists, and other communist allies, the Sharia supremacists, and God only knows how many of the, pick a number, Donald Trump says 20 million, I think, who also came into the country are jihadists.
Right. Exactly.
Anybody got a guess? I don't know. But it's more than zero, that's for sure. And then on top of that, we know for sure that about 70, maybe 100,000 were brought here from Afghanistan in the wake of that debacle. And by the way, legally insinuated into this country, put on military bases, from which, when they were tired of it, they migrated elsewhere into the country. They being not, as we were told to some extent at the time, the people who fought alongside us in Afghanistan, those were the people who could get on the planes. And the determination as to whether you got on the planes was made by the Taliban. So the chances that there will be among them, at a minimum, to say nothing of the gotaways and the others who've come in who are Sharia supremacists, will go violent alongside, quite possibly, the people that Robert has said, they get along with, at least temporarily, is very high. And this gives incredible urgency and timeliness to this conversation, because we do need to spend some time, and we will, I think, talking about what we do about this.
I want to bring up, Trevor, do you want to add to that? Or
Well, I want to make
Yeah.
the point that
Yes.
the reason we are in the mess we are in is because we have lost faith for 100 years in our own civilization, our own society. You know, Judeo-Christianity, Judaism and Christianity have both suffered major setbacks in the last century and are not as strong and as vibrant and as self-confident as they used to be. So people, when the ruling ethos of a country, Christianity, fades away, you know, things like communism, which is very certain of itself, and Islam, which is also very certain of itself, are going to attract bigger audiences. So, and that is, I think, a form of cowardice on the part of Western civilization. As Frank said, you know, leaving Iran in place, it's like invading, it's like sending all your young men to invade Normandy. You fight across France, you fight the Battle of the Bulge, and then you get to the borders of Germany and you say, that's it, you Nazis can stay in power now. After all of that sacrifice. You know, the only victory, the only thing we should be aiming here is complete victory over our enemies.
Amen.
Yeah.
And by standing up, look, if Trump, Bibi said it, you know, when they attacked Iran, he said, we are not your enemies. Rise up against the mullahs, we are with you. If Trump had said that, the mullahs would be gone by now. The CCP would be gone. You know, all of these things could happen. But what I think there's a very deep spiritual dimension to this. We have been too cowardly because we don't have faith in our own institutions, our own God, our own history, and our own culture. We let others take the moral high ground. And I believe we need, you know, Karen has a great phrase. To win this, we're going to need miracles, but we need to be miracle worthy. God doesn't help losers and whiners and whingers and wimps. God helps David and Gideon's army and the American revolutionaries. So we have to aim to win, have faith that we can win, and faith that our cause is right. Because a deep faith is what gives you the courage necessary to do what has to be done, to tell the truths that have to be said. You know, when your grandfathers and great-grandfathers were sitting on landing barges off Normandy beaches or waiting to attack Japanese islands in the Pacific, Japanese-held islands, those young boys right out of high school, they weren't sitting in the dark waiting to storm across beaches talking about baseball and girls. I think there would have been a lot of praying going on.
Yeah.
Because they knew the only way they could summon the courage to do what they had to do was to deepen their faith at the time. That's the only way they could do it.
July 13th last year in Butler, Pennsylvania, we did see a miracle, and then it was followed up November 5th with another miracle, proving we were miracle worthy. It also, you were talking about faith. One of the things that I find myself saying over and over in the context that we're talking about, we've lost faith in our faith. And I would have thought that July 13th would have boosted such faith.
I think it did for many people.
Yeah. But
Did for Donald Trump.
it did for Donald Trump. But to Trevor's point earlier, he hasn't taken it to where it needs to go, because to a man with a hammer, everything is a nail. Donald Trump is a deal maker, and he really thinks that deals can be made that are legitimate. But we all know, I don't know, is it okay if I say communists lie? Is that fair? What about Islam has at its core to lie to advance the cause, right? So
Yeah.
Trevor said he's not an ideologue, but he also doesn't seem to really understand the nature of the enemy. Am I reading that correctly?
Well, let me just say that I keep hearkening back to something that has long been lost to memory, but I actually think it was arguably one of the most important speeches Donald Trump has ever made. On the 15th of August, 2016, as the newly minted Republican nominee for president, but a very long shot candidate, Donald Trump went to Youngstown, Ohio, and delivered uncharacteristically, possibly uniquely, a speech that he read from stem to stern. And it was about the ideology that we were up against, which he called, I think wrongly, but nonetheless, his term was radical Islamic terrorism. And he used it as a vehicle for contrasting Hillary Clinton's attitude towards adherence to this ideology and the problems that we were having as a nation as a result of failing to appreciate that it is an ideology we were up against and that it had to be dealt with as such. Now, having said all that, among others who seem to have lost it to memory is Donald Trump, for the reasons that we've just been talking about. No deal is to be made on terms other than a temporary respite, or hudna, as they call it. Robert knows all about this. The exclusive purpose of which is for the otherwise losing Muslim side to regroup, to rearm, and then to re-engage when the circumstances were more conducive to their victory. That's the only deal that's to be made, ever, with Sharia supremacists. And as I said earlier, I fear that if the president doesn't get back to where he was before his first victory and persists in keeping, again, and the thing that is so maddening about this is that the very essence of the Trump doctrine, if there is one, this America First premise, is that we're not going to give up on our interests. We're going to let our allies do more to protect theirs and ours. And there is simply no better example of this in the world than Israel, which has, after these better part of 2 years now, been subjected to war from all comers, just about. 8 fronts, they call it.
Mm-hmm.
I've lost track. Maybe it's 9 now. Who's counting? The point is that if this policy of allowing those enemies of Israel and ours to regroup, to rearm, and then to re-engage, that is, ladies and gentlemen, a formula for assuring that what is truly an endless war will continue, not only continue, but possibly be accelerating in the way that my friend Robert has pointed out. These 12ers believe must happen. And believe not only that, but they believe it must happen on their watch, meaning now. For heaven's sakes, the supreme leader is what, 80 years old or something?
85.
He's got cancer. He's 85. His long watch is at an end. So if they are serious about this and what it means to achieve the golden age of Islam's arrival, the Mahdi, the Messiah figure being summoned from a well in Qum, the holy city where he has resided, we're told, since the 8th century or thereabouts.
874.
874. it will be on the basis, Robert, of an outpouring of lamentations and pleas for mercy that sound an awful lot like the apocalypse. Do we really want to wait to see how this turns out? I think not.
May
And
I
I
offer-
pray that President Trump thinks not
Right.
soon, too.
I just thought it might be in order to offer some footnotes on what Frank was just saying, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, that the only acceptable agreement is from Islamic law. That is, that what Frank was referring to is what Islamic law actually teaches, which I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, already know, that the only acceptable circumstance for an agreement with a non-Muslim entity that is fighting a Muslim entity, according to Islamic law, is when the Muslims are losing and they need a chance to regroup so they can fight and win. And Trump has offered them at least 3 chances to do this, with Hamas and Gaza, actually more than once, and with Iran, of course, when he stopped Israel and got angry because they were about to keep going, and with Ahmed al-Sharaa, the al-Qaeda leader who is now the president of Syria, who he met with and spoke about as what's such a fine young man and all this nonsense, and believing him that because he put on a tie, he was no longer a jihadi. Whereas he's abundantly proven, of course, with his now violent persecutions of the Druze, the Alawites, and the Christians in Syria, that he's very much a jihadi still, and he's practicing Muhammad's dictum, war is deceit, and that lying is allowed in wartime to give the unbelievers the impression that you were on their side when you were actually their enemy. And that's exactly what Ahmed al-Sharaa is doing, quite obviously, with Trump in Syria. And so when an Islamic entity asks for a ceasefire, everybody is so happy and wants to have peace, when actually that is the signal they ought to understand, if they knew anything about Islam, to press forward to final victory. Because that is the Islamic entity telling you that they're losing. And so that's the last time there should be a ceasefire. And as far as the Mahdi goes, I just wanted to add that it's even worse than Frank was saying. This is Twelver Shiite belief. The Twelver Shiites, Twelver Shiism is the official religion of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so the mullahs actually believe this, that there were 12 imams in Sunni Islam, which is most of the Muslims, 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide. The imam is like your local parish priest or rabbi or pastor. He's the guy at the local house of worship. But in Shiite Islam, the imam is the successor of Muhammad as the infallible leader of the Muslim community, political, military, and spiritual leader. And there were 12 imams. It was a hereditary office because he had to be part of the household of Muhammad. The last imam, the 12th imam, was a 5-year-old boy who was killed by the Sunnis, as all of them were, in the year 874. But the Shiites developed this mythology that he wasn't really dead. He wasn't killed at all. He's in occultation. He's hiding. And he's going to come back at the end of the world. Now, what will trigger him coming back? When the Muslims are more persecuted than they have ever been in the history of Islam. And so, with that in mind, consider what Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani said in 2005. He was the president of Iran from 1989 to 1997. And a few years later, he said, if we nuked Tel Aviv, that would be the end of Israel. But if they fired back, we would sustain the loss of 10 to 15 million people, and we could survive that. Now, not only was he so insouciant about the prospect of nuclear annihilation, but it seems to me to be very likely that he had in mind the idea, maybe this will bring the boy back. How could you have a worse persecution than 15 million Muslims dead? So they would be happy, in other words, to nuke Israel and get nuked in the process, because that would trigger the eschatological return of their savior figure.
Those footnotes are extraordinary. This is why we keep them around, honestly. Thank you.
Absolutely. As we look to what may or may not be happening here, given the immigration onslaught, the invasion, before we talk about that, I want to just quickly go through what we've been seeing in Europe as they're the canaries. Think of any major European city, and what is it we all say? It's lost. Paris is lost. London is lost. Stockholm is lost. Europe is lost. It's all gone. Seems to me a lot of that loss is through that exact same immigration that's been brought about, by the way, by their left, which is far more dominant than ours. So you have the left holding the door open for invasion by people who also hate them as much as the left does. We're watching city after city after city. It seems like there's a cascade of things that happen. Anybody want to jump on the horror that we're seeing march through Europe?
Well, I want to go back a little bit. You talked about the left. See, in 1965, they changed the immigration policies in this country to allow a whole range of third world country people into the country. That was done by Ted Kennedy, who was working with the communists his entire political career, who was actually doing deals with the Soviet Union to undermine Reagan. So it was a very conscious policy right back in the 60s to change the demographics of America. And to bring a lot more Muslims into the country. There's probably 3 mosques in the country at that time. And but this has been done in every other Western country. The Communist Prime Minister of Australia, who I write about in my book there, brought in 2 million immigrants to Australia in the last 3 years. 30% of Australians are not native born. 30% of Australian voters are not native born. So this is all over the Western world. This is a very conscious, deliberate policy by the Chinese, the old Soviet communists, anybody they could, to increase the third world immigration into Western countries, and primarily Islam, that they knew would cause conflict, that they knew would cause social breakdown, demoralization, all of this kind of thing. So this is not accidental. This is 100 years in the planning. Since the Bolshevik Revolution, the communists have been pushing this on every Western country. They get the left into power. The left opens the doors. Look at Minnesota.
Yeah.
Minnesota is run by communists. From the communist Finns who came to Minnesota in 1905, who were kicked out of the Russian Empire, to all the communist politicians they've had there, they made Minnesota a magnet for Muslim migrants. And it was a deliberate program because they knew that the Muslims would be a great ally in destroying the conservative movements and bringing down the country and just creating chaos. So we've got to understand the left has always paved the way for this big upsurge of Islamic migration to the West and third world migration in general, but particularly Islamic. And so now we're seeing the fruits of that in Europe, but parts of America are not far behind, as we see with Mandami, as we see with Omar Fateh, who's running for mayor of Minneapolis, as we see in the city in New Jersey, which is the Muslim city there now. As we
Patterson.
see in
Patterson.
Patterson, as we see in Hamtramck, as we've seen for years, and other parts of Michigan. But we got to understand this is planned, scientifically organized in Moscow and Beijing and Havana, and their relationships, which have gone back decades with the Islamic countries.
Mm.
You know, right from the one last thing, when the Bolsheviks took over Russia, they immediately persecuted the Christians and the Jews. They shut down churches and synagogues and slaughtered priests and rabbis, but they didn't do that to the Muslims, because the Muslims are in wild territory out in Central Asia. They didn't have full control. And if they knew they tried to do that with the Muslims, they would have had civil war all over the country. So what they did, they infiltrated the mosques and madrasas. They created what they called Soviet Islam. And so they used Soviet Islam right back then in the 1920s to start flooding Muslim refugees, Muslims into the West, and they used them to set up the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They have always used Islam as a battering ram against the West.
Mm.
And as I say, it's very effective, because if you go against Muslims, they have the cover of religion. Communism doesn't have the cover of religion. Islam does. So it's a perfect tool for the communists to push it.
Particularly places like this, where we have freedom of religion, and they make abundant use of that, of course. I just wanted to double back to something that Karen introduced in connection with her question now. Trevor talked about us having lost faith, among other things, as Karen noted, in our faith. This is on display big time in Europe. It's even more dramatic than it is here. I think it's no exaggeration to say the vast majority of churches that have not been burned to the ground, which an awful lot of them have been by the jihadis, are empty. They're museums or incipient mosques, which they will become in due course as part of this very deliberate strategy of submission. So the challenge for us is not so much figuring out where does this all lead, as much as it is how far behind Europe are we at this point? And Trevor has enumerated a number of places. I've been spending time lately in Texas.
Yes.
Whereas Karen knows, Trevor, there is now an European style jihadist, stealth jihad is the term that Robert coined, I think, for it, but jihadist campaign being mounted to create, among other things, what's technically known in certain circles as no-go zones. These are going to be places like the so-called East Plano Islamic Center City. 400 acres, 1,000 residences nestled around a big mosque. That is just one of myriad places. Trevor mentioned 3 mosques back in 1965 when Teddy Kennedy began taking this apart. Well, there's like 3 mosques on a block now in parts of Texas. It's bigger than Starbucks. And the reality is that as their numbers increase, there's more of this infrastructure being built out, almost all of it by either the Muslim Brotherhood or their Iranian counterparts, or there's actually, I guess now, 6 different networks that are operating there, the Deobandis, the Tablighi Jamaats, and the like, representing Muslims who've immigrated here from different parts of the world. But what joins them, and why I keep sort of coming back to this idea of Sharia and Sharia supremacism, is not only that that's prominently featured in my friend Robert's most of his 30 books, I think is the latest count, but like Karen, I can't keep up. He writes faster than I read. And so it was 30 last week, but I'm pretty sure it's not 30 today.
It is 31.
But whatever. I rest my case. Anyway, most of them are about this very subject. And we've just got to be clear that the guys who adhere to it, despite their various differences, including the differences between the Sunnis and the Shia, which they're perfectly prepared to paper over, after, the attacks of 9/11, which, by the way, you may remember, were perpetrated by 19 amateurs. So just remember that when you hear 150,000 professionals. Think about the damage those guys did. But anyway, the point is that when you talk about the differences in the various sects or the various traditions or the interpretations of this or that, what binds them is much more important than those differences, and especially in the face of what they see as the infidel, who must be conquered and will be more likely if they join forces for that purpose.
Remember that the Islamic Republic of Iran is Shiite and funds the Islamic Republic of Iran is Shiite and funds Hamas, which is Sunni. 93% of the funding of Hamas comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran, even though Sunnis and Shia actually hate each other and kill each other when they get the chance. Why then would Iran fund Hamas? Because there's an old Arabic proverb that translates to my brother against my brother, but both of us against our cousin. And so the idea is that the infidel, particularly Jews, are worse enemies. The Jews are designated as the worst enemies of the Muslims of all in the Quran. And consequently, the Sunni and Shia are happy to work together. Also, if I may add another footnote, the idea of inundating the West with Muslims creates a win-win situation for the left, because it dilutes the national character of the countries in which these people are coming and makes it harder for the native people to defend their own homeland, because after all, we live in a republic, and if we're outvoted, then we don't get to set the agenda. And once they have all these Muslims here voting, then it becomes more difficult to elect the people that we want. Emmanuel Macron is only president of France because of the Muslim vote. If there were no Muslims in France, he would have lost 7 years ago, not to mention more recently. And so that's the first thing. But also, the more the Islamic communities increase, the more unrest there is between Muslims and non-Muslims because of the violent, aggressive, supremacist, expansionist character of Islam, the shark aspect. And so there's always going to be violence. There has never been a place where Muslims have come in large numbers and did not commit violence against the non-Muslims. Never in human history. We will not be exempt. We will not be the first. And so that unrest is also something that the left wants. Because then, once the country is engulfed in street war, they have an excuse to clamp down with their authoritarian measures, which is what they want to do in the long run anyway. And so there's no downside as far as they're concerned. The only thing that they haven't counted on is the fact that ultimately there's only going to be those two left. And then who wins? Khomeini, the Ayatollah Khomeini, when he established the Islamic Republic of Iran, had the Tudeh party, the communists in Iran, as his strong allies. And they were very happy when he took over and thought that they would play a role in his new government. And instead, he established an Islamic Republic and put them all in prison and killed them. And I suspect that's what will happen in Europe and North America as well. But the left thinks they can ride the tiger, and they don't realize that they're dealing with an entity that has been playing this game for 1,400 years and is far more tenacious and far more sophisticated and skillful in manipulation than they're given credit for ordinarily. And so perhaps it's morbid to speak about that those two will have to fight it out. I'm still hoping that we will head that off. But I think that the left is being a little bit too sanguine about what the prospects will be if they do defeat the Patriots.
Yeah.
Could I say that what Robert said about violence always follows? That bit about history that I've been subjecting you to is not just the history of some other place. It's the history here. What we're here for, what we're talking to you about, is not just this Axis alliance, whatever you want to call it. It's not just, the two, I would argue, the three elements, and we might talk a little bit about what the globalists are contributing to all this too, but it's here. And so when you talk about, and I think this is a tremendously important point, Robert, when you talk about the inevitability of violence, you must think about this as violence that will be inflicted in our communities too, inexorably, eventually, maybe sooner, maybe later. But it does not benefit from the perception that they are winning. And you might want to pick up on this point, Robert or Trevor. When they are not defeated, they consider that a win. What Donald Trump would describe as, he's obliterated the Iranians. They were not the nuclear weapons program, certainly not their regime. They're still a going concern. And I can tell you that those jihadis in Texas are heartened by what they have seen. Even their enemies, the Iranians, pulling off in the way of a victory and seeing as the lack of their defeat as evidence of the inevitability of Israel's and ours.
And
open your Quran to chapter 8, you can read in verse 39, fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. So that's two parts. Persecution is no more is defensive. And a lot of Muslim apologists in the West will tell you jihad is only defensive. If you don't attack, then they won't bother you. But that's not the end of the verse. Fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. If you're minding your own business and your religion is not for Allah, then one day some jihadi might decide that you have to be next.
Your lunch.
And this war does not end.
You did all bring your Qurans, didn't you? You actually don't need them if Robert is around because he can recite the whole thing.
Chapter 8, verse 39. It's also in chapter 2, verse 193.
Page 365.
Chapter 8, verse 39, and chapter 2, verse 193.
So,
fight them until persecution is no more and religion is all for Allah. Allah.
I want to make another point. When you talk about Sharia supremacy, Frank, and there are those who would say you shouldn't talk about it in terms of Sharia supremacy. It's Islam. Don't belittle the fact that it's Islam. But talking about it as Sharia supremacy seems to do at least two things. One, it notes that it's a supremacist ideology, that it seeks totalitarianism, but it's easier in the United States of America to address an ideology such as that rather than a religion. Is that
well, it's not so much the ease of the addressing of it, I think. And again, I would defer to Robert on all of this because this is really his thing. I would just say that if you go at this problem as one strictly of it being Islam, or even if you wish, authoritative Islam, there isn't an American in this country, I would wager, who's going to tell you that that's not a religion. And it follows from that for most people that, well, it may have these, unsavory characteristics, but if it's a religion, we have a constitutional guarantee you can practice it. And the challenge for us is to say, look, there are things that you cannot legally do in this country that are not only countenanced by this religion, but that are obligatory. And if you are going to give that all a pass, you are inviting not only submission, but, criminal conduct on an epic scale, especially, by the way, towards women, but not exclusively. So I'm not under any illusion that this has anything to do with something other than Islam. Of course, it's an Islamic doctrine, or as I think Robert called it, Islamic law. But it's more than law. The term, as I understand it, literally translates into the path or the way to the water, some say. It's a whole way of life, is how they describe it in some texts. And that way of life is not a religion. Robert said this very well at the beginning. It's masquerading as one. But it is, in fact, it's got a patina of religiosity to it, yes. What you eat, what you don't eat, which direction you pray in, how often you pray, what you say when you pray, and all that stuff. That may not be our thing, but that's not objectionable in its own right. They start making everybody else eat halal meat or the like. That's a different thing. But that, I think, can be differentiated from all of the very objectionable stuff that is, according to the authorities of Islam, part and parcel of the practice of the faith, that is Sharia. And so I think this helps us enormously in educating people about the fact that, yes, there are Muslims who do not want to follow Sharia, who do not want to impose it via jihad or other ways, which is what they're required to do. Robert and I had a conversation about this earlier today. You just don't hear a whole lot from those folks because there's a name for them in the lexicon of the authorities of the faith. They're called apostates. And that is a capital offense that, as I understand it, can be carried out by any Muslim, essentially with impunity, on their own say-so. So these guys generally keep their heads down so they don't lose them. And that means that it's all the more important that I think we find a way that can differentiate between them and those that are genuinely jihadi and the problems, and that don't have the protection of a faith under our Constitution. How'd I do on that?
Yeah.
Any footnotes?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, could I add to that, Frank? I think it's a very important point. Now, I come originally from New Zealand, and I think my friend Malcolm, who's from Australia, which is a small island off New Zealand's he will agree that when we both came to this country, we both had to sign an oath that we had never belonged to any communist or fascist group that sought to overthrow or undermine the U.S. Constitution. Okay. Now, if you are a Sharia-compliant Muslim, you are automatically you are obligated to overthrow or undermine the U.S. Constitution, are you not?
Right.
How can you interpret it any other way? Sharia must be the law of the land, the law of the planet. Well, you come to this country, you're supposed to subjugate your beliefs to the law that is here, not try and subvert or undermine the existing constitution to suit your beliefs. So I think if we just broadened the immigration laws to not just have you ever belonged to a fascist or communist or any other type of organization that seeks to undermine or overthrow the US Constitution, you would have grounds for throwing out anybody here who basically in any way sought to impose Sharia law on any segment of the community automatically. So I think, but that takes courage and that takes faith in our institutions. But it's the only way we're going to survive as a nation is if we take that kind of stand to say that a constitution matters and you can't hide behind a religious veneer when you're promoting a political agenda. Because that's what it is. Nobody is upset. I don't see anybody who freaks out when they see a Hindu get on an aeroplane with them, or a Mormon, or a Buddhist, or a Sikh. But you get a bit edgy when you see a Muslim sometimes, don't you? Because there is a difference. Because the Hindus aren't out to take over the world in the name of Krishna. You know, this Islam is the most political religion, an overtly political religion in the world, and it's top down, it's totalitarian, and it's absolutely antithetical to the US Constitution. I'm sure if Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, all these guys were here today, when if they were writing the immigration code, Thomas Jefferson certainly would have. He would have put something in there about Islam, something that would stop Sharia law coming to this country. Remember, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, and people complain about Trump doing things without a declaration of war. Well, Thomas Jefferson sent naval warships against the Barbary pirates, didn't even tell the Congress. You know? So there's a point there. Because we fail to see or fail to acknowledge the political nature of Islam, we don't treat it what it is. It's a political threat to the safety of this country.
Islam being a religion. Islam is very difficult in this regard, and this causes a tremendous amount of confusion. I actually myself have argued against the people who say Islam's not a religion for 20-some years now, because it seemed to me to be obvious. A religion, if you look it up, it's something that purports to relate human beings to the divine. And Islam purports to relate human beings to the divine, therefore Islam is a religion. It's got prayers, it's got a holy book, it's got houses of worship, it's a religion. However, it is also quite clear that over these 20 years and more, that the idea of Islam as a religion has allowed it to do things that no other group would have been allowed to do had it not been a religion, or not been considered one. And one of the most destructive examples of that was in Detroit a few years back, when a couple of doctors from India were put on trial for practicing female genital mutilation. And the interesting thing about press coverage of Islam and the whitewashing and lying about Islam that we've been subjected to since 9/11 and before that is that occasionally there would be cases of female genital mutilation and it would be discussed in the press. I'm talking about 2000 to 2005, 2015, 2020, right up until this trial. And every time they would come around, the AP and Reuters and the New York Times and CNN, every last one of them would have the obligatory paragraph about how no religion calls for this. This is a cultural practice that is found among people of various religions. And I would write at Jihad Watch every time I came across this, it's actually something that's approved in Islam, and here's Muhammad saying to do it, and here are various Islamic jurists saying to do it, and this is something with a strong foundation in Islam to the degree that the only non-Muslims who practice it are non-Muslims who live in larger Islamic cultures and have imbibed the cultural atmosphere. And so that went on and on. Then when these doctors went on trial, suddenly, without any reference to their earlier unanimous coverage, the newspapers started to say, this is an Islamic practice that is approved from the Deobandi school in India, which is the school of Islamic jurisprudence from which the Taliban come from in Afghanistan. And so the doctors argued that this was part of their religion, which we had been told in America that was not the case for 20 years. But suddenly it's part of Islam, and it worked. The judge said this is their freedom of religion and dismissed the case. And so it became clear that it's extremely dangerous to classify Islam as a religion without further distinctions and caveats. And that at very least we need to say that the aspects of Islam that contradict existing laws ought not to be allowed to trump those laws. And there needs to be some kind of national resolution as to what constitutes a religion and whether the freedom of religion is some get out of jail free card that allows you to break all the other laws and take over because it's your religion.
The Mormons used to practice polygamy. To be admitted to the United States as a state, they had to give up polygamy, did they not?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Back in the 19th century, the Indians, the Hindus, practiced sati. They would burn widows on the funeral pyre of the husband. And a British administrator arrested some of these murderers, and they claimed, no, this is our religion, this is our culture, this is our religion. And the British guy said to them, they said, this is our custom. He said, well, our custom is to build gallows and hang murderers. You have your custom, then we shall have our custom. And Thuggy was gone very soon.
And that's faith in one's institutions,
yeah,
right?
It was faith.
Yeah.
Sati was gone very soon.
So we just heard of the various ways in which we can be subverted, but now we're literally, Frank, you already mentioned the Epic City in Texas and others. The thing that keeps striking me about Epic City in Texas is it's Texas. This isn't, a backwater. This Texas, to me, represents the most American of America. So they're not messing around. They're not doing fringy things like as they had been in Minnesota and various other places. Doing such a thing in Texas is, in a sense, it's a massive act of war. It's going after the flag in a most major way. So Frank has put together a group. They're trying to figure out how to address it. I've been honored to be part of that. But you realize it's not just elsewhere. It's not London, and it's not theoretical here. It's here. It's now. Can you tell us what's happening with Epic and the others? I know you talked about it already a little bit, but can you address that?
I'm sure these guys have got insights into it too, but just from my own experience, which has been, informed by a lot of good friends and colleagues on the ground, some of whom have been actually training, a friend of ours, John Guandolo, have been training Texans to recognize this threat and to organize to protect their communities from it. So there's now a growing presence and aggressiveness on the part of the Sharia supremacists. Yes, but there's also a growing resistance on the part of a lot of Texans. And I think that what stands out to me from this is that there is beginning to be evidence that politicians are now sensing that this is not suicidal for them to oppose what the jihadis are trying to do, whether it is build out these communities, these no-go zones, if you will, whether it is to demand that the state legislature adopt all kinds of measures that recognize Ramadan or recognize Pakistan Day or compel the schools in the state to offer, not compel them to serve to everybody, but compel them to offer halal food as part of the menu of the public schools and private schools. And as a result, I think there is beginning to be not only a bottom-up pushback, but also the beginnings of political leaders expressing concern at the minimum, if not actually trying to stop altogether what's going on, including even the governor of the state. No, I don't personally trust him as far as I can throw him, but on the other hand, he has been talking about opposing Sharia in his state. And I think I'll probably leave it at that, other than to just simply say that for reasons that Karen has kind of alluded to, I think as go Texas goes the rest of the country. And it's imperative that those in the state of Texas, whether they're in elected office or whether they're the grassroots, be helped in any way we can, both to understand and to accurately describe and to adopt techniques for resisting what is afoot, in the hopes that it will not only save Texas, but it will serve as a template for the rest of the country.
Yeah.
There's a reason why this is in Texas and not, for example, in Massachusetts or New York. It's in Texas because that's where there are patriotic Americans. It's in Texas because Texas is, in a certain sense, a symbol of American individualism and attachment to liberty and so on. It's the same thing, actually, in Tennessee. Years ago, I was speaking at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, Tennessee. And it's incredibly remote. If any of you have been there, you know you have to fly to Nashville and then drive into nothing. I'm not meaning to insult Tennessee. It's just that it's wilderness and nothing there for a couple of hours to get to Johnson City. And I was expecting that it would be a school full of agricultural students and Southerners, and that would be who I would be talking to. And I get there, and it's a hall like 200-300 people, and 95% of them are Muslims from the local mosques. And I spoke.
Welcome to Tennessee.
And they, yeah, and they had prepared, actually. They all had questions printed on cards that they were all ready to ask me, and it was very hostile and confrontational. But the point is that several years later, I spoke in Central Tennessee at a Church of Christ seminary, and they asked me about mosques springing up all over rural Tennessee in areas where they were active or where they lived. And it seems to me that there's a concerted effort to target the American heartland and the places where people are most attached to America as a country and most patriotic, rather than a lot of leftists who hate America already.
The Bible Belt.
Yeah, they're here, but this is easy. Yeah. California is easy. Tennessee and Texas will be tougher, so it takes more effort.
Right.
Yeah, the other aspect, and that's exactly right. The other aspect of it, the left and the Muslims are both going to Texas, because if you can change the voting patterns of Texas and turn Texas blue, that's the end of America.
Yes.
You know, that's it. There's no more Republican Party ever from that point. You know, they've already got California. Texas has got the next biggest number of electoral college votes. The left are putting billions of dollars into Texas. The Muslims are flooding into Texas. That is exactly as Robert says. It's a stab at the heartland of America, but it's also taking the electoral college map into full account.
I would also say that, when you talk about mosques springing up, this is, especially in a place like Texas, which is rather big on football, baseball, sports of all kinds. The old adage, if you build it, they will come. So this infrastructure is being set up not to serve an existing population in a place like Texas, but a coming population. And already in some places, it's pretty large, Dallas, Houston especially. But it's scheduled to grow. And, their birth rates typically are higher than the non-Muslim populations. And so it goes back to the point that both of these guys have made, that translates at some place in the trajectory into electoral dominance. And what we're just seeing, to remind you, I think there are two Muslim representatives in the Texas state legislature at the moment, the House. And these guys have churned out, as I think, dozens of bills or resolutions, at least, that were blithely adopted by the state legislature in its session that ended in the end of May, I think. And most of the guys who were voting on these things had no idea what was in them, let alone that the object is not narrowly to honor Ramadan, which was one of them. It's to assert the dominance of Muslims in a way that, there is no honoring of, the feast of some Hindu god or, Zoroastrians or others. It's all purposeful. That's the point.
And it is about us submitting. And by the way, the world is watching.
Mm-hmm.
China is watching, and they're seeing what will we have, what faith we have to fight back. And this keeps coming up time and time again. Surrender is not an option.
But you look what China's doing to their Uyghur population. They have no compunction about persecuting the hell out of the Uyghurs,
right,
who are Muslims, because they will foster the Muslim movement in our countries, but they sure don't want it there. And so
that's right.
But this is because they have confidence in their communist system and their Han supremacy and all this, and they don't want these Uyghurs on their western border.
And also, it has to be said that there's nobody that I know of in the Muslim world who seems to give a damn about the Uyghurs. You were talking, Robert, about, I think, Robert, maybe it's Trevor, immigration and how this is changing Europe, manifestly, the electoral, demographics and so on. A huge amount of that movement of people, the hijra, I think it's called, following the model of the perfect man. Robert can tell you a lot about the perfect man, whether he even existed, actually. But Muhammad, the perfect man, made this migration because he was thrown out of Mecca and had to find refuge in Medina. Well, ever after, this has become one of the tenets of Islam, is that you need to move to spread the faith, proselytize, dominate, wage jihad, the whole thing. But this, the point is that Turkey has been a prime mover in getting Muslims from Africa, from North Africa, from the Balkans and elsewhere into Western Europe. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the prime minister for a time, now the president for years of Turkey, is as Sharia supremacist as they come and has been very, very assiduously telling both Turks and other Muslims from Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere that they've gotten into Europe, do not assimilate. You must preserve your Muslim identity, and you must, force the rest, the hosts, the majority population, for the time being, into accommodating you and ultimately into submission. So this is very much part of the playbook, and it is being practiced here as well. It's just we are not quite as far along. The numbers, despite what Biden engineered, are not as dramatic as they are in a place like, Australia, for example, or Europe, when 2 million there, 2 million, 10 million here gets you into, a very, very, if not dominant, certainly incipient dominant position. And that means they become more aggressive. It's just, Robert, you can speak to this better than I by far. It's axiomatic that they will become more aggressive the more their numbers grow and the more they are seen to be supreme.
It should be emphasized that this is an Islamic imperative, that Muhammad the Prophet said, Islam must dominate and not be dominated. And there is no scenario in the Quran or anywhere in Islamic tradition or law that allows for non-Muslims and Muslims to live together as equals in a society where the Muslims are not trying to dominate. They do not envision, in other words, any possibility of living at peace and as equals with the unbelievers. The objective is to subjugate the unbelievers. And look, you can see how it works. Trevor mentioned early on Hamtramck, Michigan, historically a Polish town near Detroit and Dearborn, and started to get Muslim immigrants. And then because the left was committed to diversity, the leftists encouraged the Muslims to seek political power, which the Muslims were only all too happy to do because Islam must dominate and not be dominated, because political power is part of the religion as they practice it. And so they got a couple of members of the city council, and eventually there was a Muslim mayor elected, and a few years go by and more elections. And now Hamtramck is so diverse that every member of the city council is a Muslim and the mayor is a Muslim. And that's the outcome of diversity, is not just Islamic supremacy, but dominance. And what's most interesting about this whole trajectory is that in Hamtramck, they outlawed the waving of the pride flag on city property or planting it anywhere. And so the left's religion was suddenly repudiated by the very people the left had helped put in power. And not only that, but then a former leftist city councilwoman actually plaintively said, "What are you doing? You have betrayed us. We helped you. We encouraged you. We taught you how to play politics in the United States. You owe your victories to us, and now you are betraying our agenda." And they said, "Yeah."
I
There you go.
exactly.
Could I just add one quick point? I don't know if there's a new mayor, but the mayor of Hamtramck was appointed by President Trump to be our ambassador to Kuwait. Now, I don't know about you, but the idea of sending a Sharia supremacist to a relatively moderate Muslim Arabic nation as the emissary and representative of the United States of America is not a good thing.
Yeah. I just heard, it was yesterday or the day before, the Prime Minister of Canada gave a speech where he said, Canadian values are Muslim values. And the crowd cheered. And a few hours later, it's my understanding that an imam in Canada said, basically, jihad, fight, 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 never surrender. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of symmetry in the power structure of this axis or alliance. The left capitulates at every possible turn to Islam, to Sharia, to anything that they want. And Robert, to your point about has there been any kind of reciprocity where it's a stupid question, but I just want to get it out there. Has there been any kind of steps taken by imams or any leadership in Islam that is at all towards our left?
It never happens.
Of course,
The
Pardon
dialogue
for asking, but
and the outreach and the bridge building is all in one direction. Sayyid Qutb was the great theorist of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 20th century. He was actually executed by the Nasser regime in Egypt in 1966 because Nasser wanted to keep a lid on the Brotherhood. But he wrote a great many books and was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, really. And he posited Islam as the solution to the problems of the 20th century world. He said capitalism and communism have both failed and they're both spent forces. And now Islam is the alternative. And in any case, he wrote about how important it was to build bridges with people of other faiths. And this is something that the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Jews, pretty much everybody has taken up enthusiastically. And Sayyid Qutb said, the bridge is a one-way bridge. The bridge is designed to bring people into Islam. It is not to make some accord with the kuffar, with the unbelievers. But the unbelievers never seem to get that. And one of the most egregious examples of this was when 100 Muslim scholars, you may remember some years ago, Pope Benedict XVI, 2 popes back, he made an address in Germany, at Regensburg in Germany, where he caused tremendous anger and outrage among Muslims worldwide and sparked riots because he quoted a 14th century Roman emperor, Manuel II Palaeologos, saying there's nothing Muhammad brought but what is evil and inhuman. And so to show that Muhammad was not evil and inhuman, Muslims started killing innocent people in outrage at the Pope. And so 100 Muslim scholars wrote to the Pope and they offered dialogue and said, let's build bridges and talk. And the epigraph to their statement was a quotation from the Quran that said, say to the unbelievers, let there be a discussion between us and you. And that was basically where it stopped. And so it looked like it was an invitation to dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And in all of the discussion about this and all the many commissions and dialogue business that was built up after this, nobody ever thought to look up that verse in the Quran and see what the whole thing said. Because what it actually says is, let us come to a common accord between us and you that you will worship no God but Allah and associate no partners with him, which is what they accused the Jews and Christians of doing, of associating partners with Allah. And if you think, how do the Jews associate partners with Allah? Jesus, I understand, but the Jews? Yes, because the Quran says, no Jews have ever been found who do this, but the Quran says that the Jews say Ezra is the son of God. And so, because the Quran says that, they say the Jews associate partners with Allah. So, the call to dialogue, in other words, even in the epigraph, was a deceptive call to Islam. But nobody seems to get this, and the dialogue's a big industry now, and it's building bridges all right and leading people into Islam.
Right. Let's talk about New York. the
Yeah.
right.
Let's talk about New York. What?
People seem to be expressing shock that Mamdani, whose first name I don't remember, who is
Zorhan.
how could I forget? Zohran Mamdani is now the Democrat nominee for mayor of New York City, the most important city in the country, the locus of not only capitalism and where most good things are flowing from, but also, let's not forget, 9/11, which we remember as Islamic Jihad. This was a terrorist attack, but most of our compatriots haven't a clue. So it's not so much that they've forgotten, it's that Islam has been wiped from our collective memory about it, and that's another reason it's so important we're here. It was real. It did happen. It was Islamic. And it was jihad, and it was Islamic terrorism. So to say that the New Yorkers were ignorant, I think, is in part true, but it's also in part the consequence of a very deliberate, assiduous whitewashing of the facts at the time. So here he is now, this Democrat nominee of New York City, again, representative of the United States in a similar way that Texas is. How did this happen? I read an article just today by The Guardian that was celebrating him. It's The Guardian, so of course. But they were also pointing out how the Muslim community was also celebrating him. Also, no surprise, but saying, oh my gosh, you guys, we hadn't considered that we should enter the political arena nationally, and certainly, obviously we know in these pockets that we've been talking about, but they are taking heart at his success. This is one of those other things that's got to be nipped in the bud. I mean, to me, this is completely terrifying. As goes Texas, so goes the nation, but as goes New York. I would argue similarly. What do you see as why, and how do we stop it?
Well, on the why, Mamdani is he comes from a Marxist family. He's a member of Democratic Socialists of America. But we need to understand that is a communist party. They're not Democrat. They have communist members. They have good relations with communist Cuba, communist parties all over America, cross membership with the Communist Party USA. They have 10,000 members in New York. He had 20,000 volunteers on the ground. So most of them were DSA, but then they had CARE, Students for Justice in Palestine, Palestinian youth movement, all the mosques. Plus they had another 30,000 people from out of state, phone banking, donating, coming to New York. So this is how they got AOC into Congress. That DSA nationalizes these elections. So the Democrats will have 200 volunteers, DSA will have 5,000. The Democrats will have millionaire money, the DSA has union money and foundation money, plus in this case the Muslim money as well. So this isn't some big swing to the left in New York. This is a very deliberate a tactical alliance between a radical communist organization plus a coalition of radical Islamic organizations, many of which are communists. There's a lot of communists in CARE. Nihat Awad was a communist before he became a Muslim. There are tons, Linda Sarsour is a Marxist, people like this. So this is to set up a counter state in New York. In Maoist philosophy, and Zoran's father is a Maoist. They set up you take over an area, and you take over the government. You start looting the treasury. You hire people. You build a fortress. You build a counter state that is a revolutionary base. They've already done this in Jackson, Mississippi. They've done it in Hamtramck and places like this. But this is deliberate Maoist Muslim strategy to take over areas. This is the most important financial center in the world, one of the biggest Jewish centers in the world. They're going to defund the police. They're going to collapse the tax base. They're going to drive the real estate market in Miami through the roof. And they're going to just create chaos. This is going to be President Trump's biggest problem. Make Xi Jinping look like a pansy if this guy is elected.
Interesting thing about this guy's background. As Trevor said, his father's a Maoist. Zohran Mamdani was born in Uganda and came to the United States when he was 7 years old. And his father is, as noted, a communist, and he learned communism from a very early age and is a deeply committed communist. But what's an interesting side note about this is that Mahmoud Mamdani, his father, did not become a communist in Uganda. He became a communist in the United States. He was in Uganda in an Indian family, and he was given a scholarship when Uganda became independent. The United States government gave a number of scholarships to young Ugandans to come to the United States to study. And this is the early 60s. And so he got this gift. Many people applied, and he was one of the ones who won. And he came to the University of Pittsburgh, and he was going to study to be an electrical engineer. But when he came to the University of Pittsburgh, he was introduced to the student SNCC, the group that was behind the civil rights protests. And that was a group that was tied to Marxism. He went down to Birmingham, Alabama, and marched and was thrown in jail. He called the Ugandan ambassador with his one phone call, and the Ugandan ambassador was angry with him and said, "What are you doing getting involved in the affairs of a foreign country?" And he said, "It's a struggle for justice, man. We just got our independence last year, and it's all the same struggle." He was already getting to be indoctrinated with not just the civil rights movement, where you have a just cause, but with the Marxist people who were taking advantage of it. He actually claims, whether or not this is true, that it was the FBI questioning him after this and asking what he thought of Marx, and he said, "I haven't met him." And they said, "Well, he's dead." And he's, "Oh, what happened?" "He died a long time ago. We were just wondering if you'd read his books." "No, I never heard of him." And so he went out, he says, and found every book of Karl Marx. I don't know if I buy that story. Because I think it's much more likely he was introduced to Marx by his friends he was traveling to Birmingham, Alabama with, and so on, and in the university environment there. But it's an interesting thing to note that this communism that we are now being plagued with in New York is something that comes from the leftist dominance of American universities.
Yeah.
And also, fun fact to know and tell, I'm told, I think by Trevor, if I'm not mistaken, Mamdani is a 12er.
Yes.
A convert to Shia Islam and the 12er sect, which, as we were just talking about, is the one that brings the 12th Imam out of the well, right? And just to give you a sense of how crazy this is, they've actually built a superhighway freeway to bring him in the style that he should become accustomed from the well into Tehran. This is actually a thing. So, their commitment to making this happen must not be underestimated. This is going back to what I said at the beginning. This is what makes so perilous, giving them an opportunity to continue their program in Iran. And I'm not here to tell you what would come if there is, in fact, an end of this regime. I don't know. Nobody does. I do personally believe that the people of Iran do not want more of this kind of theocratic, totalitarian repression. And if they have their way, I think they'll get something different. Now, is that a strongman? Is that a general? Is that a secular guy? TBD. But I can tell you this with some confidence. It can't be worse than what they've got now. Certainly not for us, and I think not for them as well. So I pray that it will not be persisting.
So we're at this point, what do we do? We're at a precipice. It is urgent. They're on our soil. They've proven their determination. We're not revealing much of our own determination except in certain pockets. What do we do about the red, the green? We'll hold off on the blue for the time being, but the red-green alliance, and we can wrap the blue into there as well. But this alliance, what can we do? Thoughts? Hate to just leave and go, well, it's, done, like Europe. How do we fight, Trevor?
Well, if you're drowning in your bathtub, the first thing you do is turn the water off. Okay.
So close the borders?
We have to close the border. And when you're drowning in your bathtub, the first thing you do is turn the water off. Okay. So meaning that we have to I would declare, if I was President Trump, I would basically declare a moratorium on all immigration for the next 20 years. All of it. And then you modify the immigration code to be very explicit that no Sharia-compliant Muslim can come here. And if they lie and come here and they're discovered, they lose their citizenship straight away. And then there has to be a systematic deportation of any that can be deported. And then there has to be a very clear crackdown and a very explicit crackdown on, just like, the mafia used to always, when the police would go after the mafia, they'd always say, this is anti-Italian, right? And the Italian community was scared of the mafia and wouldn't say much. It was only when the police started taking the mafia down that the Italian community had the courage to stand against the mafia to some degree. And I think the same has to happen here with the radical mosques. They have to be made very unwelcome here. They have to be investigated on and prosecuted very, very vigorously. And people need to be deported when they have broken the law. So I think only a full crackdown on Islam will cause at least some Muslims to reconsider their path, to reconsider, do we want to be part of a secular America and just make some money and live well, or do we really want to carry on this 13th century struggle? And as the younger generation comes through, like in Iowa, for instance, you got a lot of Bosnian Muslims, and they were always pretty secular anyway. They ate pork, and they were Muslim by heritage, and they've fitted in pretty well in Iowa. They're not a big problem. They don't tend to be well, Robert may correct me, but you don't see much radicalization in that community. So it has to be a very clear policy and an unashamed policy that anything that smacks of Sharia, terrorism, support for terrorism will not be tolerated. And Trump's taken the right approach. Any student caught up in these demonstrations, you're going home straight away. But that has to be applied on a much stronger basis, plus to the Chinese communists as well. The same principles need to be applied. There should be complete ban on any further immigration from communist China and a deportation of all the non-citizens, right off the bat.
Yeah.
So without any embarrassment about it.
People always say, hello? People always say America is an idea, it's not an ethnicity. You've heard this, right? Mm-hmm. That this is the country of people who adhere to certain principles regarding the nature of human beings and the nature of governance. And We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
So then we're completely inconsistent in regard to that and let in all manner of people who don't believe any of that. And we don't hold them to it. So are we a nation of these principles or are we not? It ought to be a matter of deportation if any action is taken that goes against those principles that they swear to adhere to when they enter the country in any case. I knew this guy when I lived in New York years ago who married a woman from Peru and moved to Peru. And he's been living now in Peru since the 80s, I guess, maybe the 90s. And he's got children who were born and grew up in Peru, and their mother is Peruvian. And he was telling me not long ago that, well, they're not actually fully Peruvian because the Peruvian government is very tough about who gets to become a citizen and under what circumstances. And because they have an American father, they're not really considered Peruvian. And I thought, so Peru has a greater sense of its own identity and a greater sense of self-preservation than the United States of America does. And why can't we be like Peru? And if we're not, we want to reject some kind of any idea that there's some dominant ethnicity that you have to be part of. That's great. That's fine. But why can't we say you have to hold to these principles and stick to it and enforce it? And that would go a long way to solving the problem were that to be applied. But nobody seems to even be discussing that. What is it that makes an American? What is the nature of our national identity and what makes for our national unity? Everything has been working to break it down. So that now really all we have left is this kind of hollow sentimentalism. I'm proud to be an American. At least I know I'm free. Well, that's great, but the song's going to end and then what? And nothing is being, even the song is not being enforced.
Right.
Those who are not proud that we're free and those who want to enslave the rest of us, they're still running around loose. So we have to be standing for something here and have some kind of identity. That's job one.
I want to yield in a moment to Trevor because he's got a tremendously important to-do item that I've at every opportunity on our road show and on our show and otherwise I urge him to talk about because I think it's something that really needs to be baked into a strategy for trying to protect us against the red, the green, and the blue. And I want to finish just on the blue because we haven't really discussed it much, but there have been two things that have happened just this week. One good, one not so good. And the way I would characterize what the blue is about, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, is it seeks a world government. All of these guys seek a world government. Their particular world government is not, well, depending on who you're talking about, I guess, Chinese communism. World Economic Forum is actually so big on Chinese communism that you may or may not know this, but there's the famous meeting each year in February in Davos, Switzerland. But there's another meeting half a year later in China where they bathe in the glories of communism. And Klaus Schwab was pretty explicit, and I think many of those, especially when they would actually have Xi Jinping come and see them, about how they revere the efficiencies of Chinese communism and the like. But the special world government that the globalists have in mind for us is one where we are ruled by unaccountable, unelected elites. And they have a lot more in common across the world than they do with any of their native counterparts. And what they're seeking most especially is to create a surveillance state that is capable of complete control over the world's population. And this may sound hyperbolic or even ridiculous, but they're deadly serious about it. And they have a model. This comes back to the admiration that they have for the Chinese Communists. The Chinese Communist Party has instituted, as you probably know, something they call the social credit system. And the social credit system is a function of certain technological advances. They've essentially wall-to-wall surveillance cameras. They collect immense amount of data, both from those cameras and from social media and the internet and every other possible means. And then they use quantum computing and big data analysis and the like to establish the whereabouts of everybody in China. Not only the whereabouts, but what they're doing. What they're saying, what they're reading, what they're thinking, what they're sharing with their friends on social media, where they work, where they bank. And this creates what a colleague of ours, Reggie Littlejohn, has coined the term for, I think, called the digital gulag. And the digital gulag becomes operational when you essentially take all of that data and you decide to assign a score in terms of how good a communist the individual is. If they're good communists, they get to live a reasonably free life within Chinese restrictions, of course. If they're not a good communist, it's not so good. That's not life at all in some cases. But you may wind up in the actual gulag, or you may simply find yourself out of work or unable to, have your kids educated or travel even internally, locally. I mean, it is hugely punitive. And the point is, ladies and gentlemen, that what they're trying to do is to create such an arrangement here. And one of the vehicles that they've been using, unbeknownst to most of us, is the World Health Organization, an outfit which came to some notoriety during the recent unpleasantness of COVID-19, where essentially you had the Director General doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party, who was responsible for placing him in that job, by the way. Tedros Ghebreyesus is his name, and he was the one who lied to us about the origins,
Yes,
per the Chinese line, lied to us about the nature of the disease, per the Chinese line, and lied to us about what needed to be done about it, per the Chinese line. By some estimates, millions of people around the world lost their lives because of the bad advice that Tedros served up. So they've now had, up until today, literally today, an opportunity for nations to extricate themselves from amendments to something called the International Health Regulations, which would help advance this social credit scheme. And it's a long story. We can get into it on another occasion. But the short form of it is this. The President of the United States, operating through Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr., yesterday announced that we were not going to allow those amendments to bind us. Now, it's a big deal, folks, because were that not the case, even though the president said, hey, we're going to get out of the World Health Organization in January of next year, these things would still apply.
Right.
That's the good news. The bad news is that President Trump yesterday signed into law something called the Genius Act. And I don't know if you're tracking on this. I don't know a whole lot about it myself. But I did hear Marjorie Taylor Greene talking on a show the other day that this Genius Act is going to create essentially the regulatory arrangements and then maybe some of the infrastructure for something that the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government, certainly in the previous administration, have been very keen to do. And that's something called central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. And CBDCs are an incredibly powerful tool for enforcing that good behavior in a social credit system, because in addition to not getting your kids schooled and not having employment and not being able to travel and the like, you can simply lose your bank account, your access to digital or other kinds of funds. And we saw some of this in Canada. Speaking of Canadian values, under the previous government of Trudeau, truckers lost their bank accounts because they dared to go into places like Toronto and Ontario and so on in their trucks in protest of the government's treatment of COVID, because it was totalitarian in character. So I just wanted to share with you, in terms of things that need to be done, one of the things is Marjorie Taylor Greene said that the Speaker of the House, having refused to offer an opportunity for people to vote down the central bank digital currency prohibition that she was offering, among others, I think, has promised that in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the next must-pass piece of legislation that the House is likely to take up, an offer will be made to allow a vote on that prohibition. Now, she says, well, even if that were approved in the House, the Senate won't agree to it. They will not permit that provision to be put into the bill. And therefore, we'll be stuck with a CBDC here in short order, perhaps. What I would say to you is this. I think if folks like you and many others of us who are trying to figure out what do we do about this totalitarian thing, the trifecta especially, let's hold Speaker Johnson to that promise. Point one, make sure that there is an opportunity to vote to prohibit this. The president has said he doesn't want a CBDC, by the way. Others in the administration, not so much, but he has said that. He promised it on the campaign trail, as a matter of fact. And then let's turn our voices loose on the United States Senate to make sure that they understand that we don't want a central bank digital currency, and we want them to prohibit it as well. And in that regard, I'll just close with this. There was another provision recently, as you may know, on another aspect of what I think is basically this creeping, submission to totalitarianism. And that was in the form of legislation that was intended to be in the one big, beautiful bill that would have said that the states across this country cannot, for 10 years, pass any legislation that would restrict what I call Franken AI. That is to say, artificial intelligence that is a monster that will wind up destroying us. Some say we have to compete in an open-ended way so that we get to whatever the destination is before the Chinese do. The problem is that if we become China in the process, thanks to Franken AI, we're really going to be hosed. Anyway, the point is that that piece of legislation originated in the House. They had to fix it to make certain Senate procedural arrangements. A woman, speaking of Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn, engaged in an initiative with Senator Ted Cruz to try to fix this make it a little less onerous. She said, just 5 years. And then she began hearing from us.
Mm-hmm.
And she decided instead to partner up with not Ted Cruz, but Maria Cantwell, a Democrat from Washington State, to strike the whole thing. And they forced a vote on the issue, and the Senate went from being almost certain to rubber stamp what the House had done to voting 99-1 against it. So we can make a difference. And we need to make sure we make a difference in CBDCs and the global power.
So thank you so much. We have questions, but it's also 9 o'clock. I know. But I want to ask this, and there's a few questions that kind of address this. Where is there a light that we can look to that it's not quite so dark? Frank, you just told us something which is very heartening, aside from the CBDC. But when we speak up, we can affect change. And the Franken AI, to have that shut down, and then the no on the IHR resolutions is tremendous. Are there other places we can look, Trevor, Robert? And I wish we could do this all night. And when we put this together, we have hours and hours of things we could talk about, but we'll just wrap it up with this. The mic.
The immigration issue is a huge one. I think the Supreme Court overturning the ability of little tin pot judges in California to dictate immigration policy, I think is massive. And I think this country is going to look very different in 2 or 3 years' time with quite a few million people going across the border. I think that's huge.
The other way.
Yeah, the other way. And I think what's happening on the getting out of the World Health Organization is huge. And I think the next push should be we basically legalize the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas operating here, and we promote Ted Cruz's bill. And I think
criminalize it.
Talk about your amnesty.
But we really, I wish we had time to hear the whole amnesty thing, but because it's so great. Very, very short. Yes.
Okay.
If you can.
Okay. The big problem is we got massive foreign infiltration in the country. Iran, China, Muslim Brotherhood, millions of them here. How do you get rid of it? You treat it like organized crime. The president gets the FBI, sets up a new unit inside the FBI to deal with foreign infiltration and traitors in our system. Then the president declares a 3-month amnesty. All traitors in America, whether you're foreign-born or native, if you're foreign-born, you got 3 months to leave the country and never come back. That's it. You're gone. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese that leave the country, because if you're still here at the end of 3 months, you're going to jail for a very long time. Then there's an amnesty on all domestic traitors. Everybody who spied for an enemy, worked for the Muslim Brotherhood, worked for the cartels, the Russians, the Chinese, whatever, has 3 months to come forward and register their name with the FBI and be prepared to testify in court what you did, what you stole, what you betrayed, whatever you did, and you will get amnesty from prosecution. That would melt down every foreign intelligence operation in the country, because the Iranian businessman paying off the senator wouldn't know if the senator had taken a deal and was wearing a wire, and the senator wouldn't know if the Iranian businessman had taken a deal and was wearing a wire. You would have a massive clean out. You'd have big tech guys standing down. You'd have senators leaving office for family reasons. You would have a whole clean out. You wouldn't fire a shot. And most of these people would be able to live their lives. There'd be forgiveness if they came clean. But the very few who didn't come clean, we would have so much evidence we could prosecute them, put them in jail for the rest of their lives, and the American public would finally understand how deep the penetration was and accept the security measures necessary going forward so it doesn't happen again. It's how you take down the mafia, it's how you take down organized crime, and it has to be applied to foreign infiltration.
It's such a great idea, and I think when we in the bio that I have for Trevor, one of the things that I say is an innovative thinker and problem solver, and voila! Thank you, Trevor, for it's a genius idea. Robert, do you?
You asked for signs of hope, right?
Yes.
Yes, I think the major sign of hope, and please don't get me wrong here, is the president. Not because he's perfect. He's actually bothering me in a lot of ways lately. But the president's the very fact that he is president is an indication that these extraordinarily strong and clever forces that are arrayed against us are not perfect. And they don't win all the time. They didn't want him to be president. They certainly didn't want him to be president twice. They threw everything at him that they could, including trying to kill him. And he's still there.
Yeah.
And so the primary lesson of Trump is that the evil forces do not have everything under control and are not guaranteed victory. And they're not just going to roll from victory to victory. He's knocked them back on their heels, and for all his faults, that shows that it can be done, and we need to keep doing it.
Well, I want to thank you. Yes.
1 minute.
Now,
Yes,
we need to
go
win
ahead.
the midterms.
Yeah, we need to win the midterms. Yes.
The 1 minute is this. I think another hopeful sign
Yes.
that you alluded to at the beginning is what Tulsi Gabbard has come forward with.
Yes.
Robert and I had this conversation earlier today. We'll see what comes of it, but I think it's an enormously promising thing. Tulsi Gabbard is the director of national intelligence, and she's just offered abundant documentation that there was a treasonous coup against the president of the United States.
And is willing to
urging prosecution.
Yes.
Urging prosecution.
Fabulous.
And lastly, I would just say the other very hopeful thing is that the power of prayer is very much with us, and we need to exercise it.
Well, I want to thank Trevor, Robert, Frank. This was, aren't they just absolutely marvelous? Thank you. Thank you so much.